Welcome to Mirage. Today we're going to be speculating on Western fiction. Joining me is Nancy Quinn, and I believe we're going to be speculating on Laura Ingalls Wilder. You picked this author.
I'm a great fan of hers. I grew up reading her books and dreaming about moving to the West, which I eventually did. And even my children, I homeschool them, and I enjoy reading to them. And now that they're older, they've read through her books. So, yes, I find her quite inspiring in her writing and in her life as well.
So where did she wrote about Wisconsin though, right? Now what did she write about? What was the West to her?
Well, she was born, I believe it was February the 7th, around 1867. And they actually didn't live in what you would consider the West proper, like Colorado or Montana, this far west. But they did leave Minnesota and they moved around to different parts of the country during the time of the homesteading. Remember when we talked about how you could get those 160 acres?
Uh-huh.
And so if you went out and settled the land, then and stayed on it for, I believe it was 5 years, and proved it up or homesteaded it, improved it, farmed it, even they considered a small shack an improvement. In time, that land could be deeded to you. So that's what they did as a family. And the stories start out with her being a little girl, and it talks a lot about their daily life and how they lived basically a rural pioneer style. And then in time, the father decided to go ahead and have a chance at that land, so they moved the family. And it's a basically chronicled stories, some fiction mixed in, but a lot of truth to how they lived every day and how they traveled and basically homesteaded each one of the places they lived in her life.
She was she was very old when she wrote her first novel. It looks like
It,
1932 is when she put that out. She was born in
that's true.
67. So what is that? Do the math for me. That's 33 plus 32 is 65. Really? Wow. She was really old when she wrote her first novel.
Oh no, don't say really old because she's only 10 years older than I am.
Well, she's only like 13 years old, 12 years older than I am. Wait, a
So,
lot older. I'm for
so
I can't do
let's be
math.
careful about that when we started writing and how old we were.
You still beat her though. You still beat her.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. I did.
65 years old and she wrote a novel. And not only that, she wrote a classic. I
She did.
mean,
Her stories are just legendary,
yeah.
and they live on and they inspire so many people.
Yeah,
It's
I can't believe that. Now she wrote one novel in 1932 at 65 years old, and it became a worldwide classic. It's unbelievable to me. We don't know anything about before 1932 though, do we? She was a school teacher.
She was a school teacher, and I believe she started teaching school when she was about 15 or 16 years old. So,
Teaching school at 15,
she,
16 years old.
mm-hmm.
What was the West's ideas of marriage at that time? If you were a family and you had a young girl who's 15, 16 years old, would they be marrying you off, or they would be taking care of you still?
I honestly think it depended on the family. There were some families that did encourage the girls to marry young. And at 16, 17, 18, they were often married and beginning their families. Unfortunately, it was also true that some of the younger girls were actually discouraged from marrying because the parents wanted someone to be around to take care of them in their older age.
Interesting. And they'd have a bunch. They wouldn't just have one or two. They would like
Correct.
have a collection of kids.
They generally had large families, and it was very sad to say that often the mortality rate among the children was high.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was pretty common to lose a child in a family, sometimes more than one.
That's incredible. Yeah, during that time, you were more expected to die than live. I'm looking at a picture of her parents, and they were hipsters. The guy's got like, if you got the Wikipedia page open, he's got one of those full beards with no mustache. like the Amish or something. I wonder if they were Amish.
No, I don't think they were Amish, but think about it. At the time, they didn't have they didn't have a nice bathroom to bathe and clean up in every night. The men probably, as a rule, weren't going to take the time to shave every day. So life was very, very different, and it was quite hard from what we think of.
Yeah.
In the cities, of course, it wasn't so bad. They had a lot of, privilege and accommodations and conveniences. But when you left all of that and moved out to 160 acres of land with nothing there but trees, and you had to dig your own well and build your own shelter, and you're right, he probably wasn't real concerned about shaving or keeping as clean as people normally would want to. It was harder to do back then.
No doubt. I mean, they didn't have soap in hospitals yet. When did that
That's true.
happen?
Yeah, and they weren't concerned with washing their hands. They didn't know a lot about germs. Um, that part wasn't pleasant, and in fact, it's kind of interesting that the rise even of frontier medicine, it didn't start coming about until some of the women doctors, as women in time began to pursue medical careers, and they were shunned in the cities. But they started going out to the mining camps, and they started going out to the frontier because at that point there were no doctors, and families
They'll
and
take
men,
whatever they can get.
right, they were happy to have a doctor whether it was a woman or not.
I mean,
So
it's kind of interesting though if you think about how this young woman could decide I'm a teacher at 15 or 16 years old. I wonder if they could also just declare themselves as doctors too. I'm a doctor. Why? Because I say so.
well, again, I'm going to answer that sort of with yes and no from my understanding. When she decided to be a teacher, it had been a dream of hers, that's true. And I think her mother, who was a teacher, really tried to encourage her in that regard. In fact, in the books, it even stated that she had some reservations about it, but she knew that it was a good idea and that it was a good job and that it would bring some money in. And according to the stories, the little town that she was in didn't have a school teacher. And so even though she was maybe a little younger than they wanted, they just sent someone in to give her a little, I guess, like a test
Yeah.
and exams. And if she could go ahead and pass those, then they just made her a teacher. And I don't think they really focused on the idea of how old she was.
She wouldn't be teaching people calculus either, or algebra, or biology, or anything. She would be teaching the rudimentaries of education,
Absolutely.
add and subtract
Absolutely.
and read and the alphabet and things like that.
Yes. And so in these small rural schools, you could maybe have somebody that was a first or second grade level and a fourth and fifth grade level. It truly was the whole concept of the one room schoolhouse where she was teaching different ages. But you're right, it wasn't advanced studies.
I mean, she probably did not get advanced studies either. I mean, what does it say her education was? Does not say what her education was at all. So she didn't
It
have one formally.
it doesn't. And I think that's where the idea of her writing the books that came in, her daughter Rose actually was educated. And so it was her daughter that really helped her edit
Oh,
a lot of the
interesting.
stories and take the true concept of what was going on, but make them marketable.
Make it marketable as in telling a good story.
Well, marketable in the effect that a publisher would see it as professional enough to pick it up and want to publish it and print it.
Hmm.
In fact, I think her original story was actually called Pioneer Girl, and it was written more for adults. And when the manuscripts were looked over by her daughter and by the publisher, her daughter was actually in a publishing house at that point in time in her life. She was grown and had some college and had worked in publishing. And so when they looked at the idea and her daughter Rose kind of cleaned it up and helped edit it, they decided it would actually be better as a young adult or children's stories rather than written for adults. And so they called it Little House on the Prairie.
She was not a spring chicken at that time either. 1932. She's in her 50s, right?
I believe you're right. Yes. I think Rose even started some of her literary career working in what we now call yellow journalism. And she started out, I think, writing more sensational type stories or kind of making up biographical information about people.
Not fake news.
Oh, kind of. I might be wrong about that, but if I remember reading correctly, I think that's where she actually got her start. But she didn't stay there very long, and then she and her mother decided to collaborate and work on these books, and they went into more professional publishing, and quite successfully.
What do you mean by well, how do you classify
Well,
successful?
look at how well the books did, and
Yeah.
there was actually a series of them, and I think the last one was called. You have to look this up for me. I think it was called The Last 4 Years, and that was actually published posthumously after she had already passed away.
She let's see. How many books do you think there were?
I think there was. Let's see. There was
The
Little House
first
on the
4 years.
Little House in the
Yeah.
Big Woods, and Little House on the Prairie, By the Shores of Silver Lake. There was The Long Winter.
I'm
Am I
counting
forgetting?
mine.
Yeah, am I forgetting? I'm probably forgetting one because I don't
Let's
have it
see
right
what
in
it
front of
is. You're right about the last one, the first 4 years, and
me.
then These Happy Golden Years,
Oh,
Little
that's right.
Town on the Prairie, The Long Winter, By the Shores of Silver Lake, On the Banks of Plum Creek, Little House
Hmm.
on the Prairie is the first one. Or Farmer Boy, actually. Little
Farmer
House
Boy
in the
was,
Big Woods.
yeah, that was her first one. And Farmer Boy was actually written more of the story about her husband and his growing up years.
Where'd he grow up? What is
I
his
don't
name?
remember. Yeah, I
What
don't I
is
don't
his
remember
name?
at the moment.
Almanzo? Uh,
Almanzo
Almanzo
Wilder.
Wilder. Interesting name. Monzo. He was born in Missouri. So they met in Missouri.
He was one of the younger homesteaders that came out. I
I'm
think
sorry, he
when
was
they
born in New
met,
York. I have no clue what I'm talking about. He died in Missouri.
I think they both did, didn't they?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't I don't propose to be an expert on her life or her history, but I do enjoy her stories and I do enjoy the whole idea behind her stories and looking at it from the perspective of Laura being the age she was. And what's nice throughout the books, you see her grow and change and mature, and you kind of go right along with her in the stories until, of course, she gets to the point where she's married, and they even have a book about that. But I just I just found them so inspiring, and I love learning about even their daily routines of how they put their food up for the winter, how Ma worked and made her butter, and how the girls had to help with the daily chores and things. So it was just a nice chronicle of that point in time. And they talked about, of course, the hardships as well. So it's a real interesting journey.
When did you read these books? How old were do you think?
I
Old do
think,
you think you were?
yeah, when I started reading them, I was probably about 7 or 8. And I still enjoyed them. When I read them with my girls in school, we would read them out loud together. I was teaching them how to read, and this was a series of books I chose. And even while I sat and listened to them read to me, I enjoyed them all over again.
It's interesting. What compels you about them? I mean, have you always had kind of like a interest in moving out west? Is that kind of what drew it, or was it something more?
No, I think I've always had an interest in it. And so when I discovered the books at such a young age, the idea of getting into your covered wagon and packing up everything you have and starting a new life was
That's
just
the thing,
fascinating.
isn't it? A new life. I mean, you leave everything behind. You can be whoever you want to be in the West. Just make it
You
up.
do. You do, and even though the wagon train era wasn't that long of a period of time, because soon the trains came and you could come out by train. But for the people that did decide to move out early and gather up all their belongings, put them all on a big wagon and drive away. I mean, imagine that.
Yeah,
And
that's crazy. And you could see ruts still to this day from the wagon train out there in the middle of wherever it is. They were so deeply embedded in the ground.
well, what they were also finding too was different items, household items that, for example, they were driving along and they would find that it was just getting too heavy to carry it all. Or perhaps they couldn't cross the water with so much weight. And so along the way, you might find something very cherished of theirs, like a desk or a piano or something that had to be taken off the wagon because they knew they couldn't carry it any further.
It's crazy. Huh. And that was so dangerous too. It's incredible.
Oh, it
So
was.
you go out there, you decide you're going to be a teacher at 15 or 16, or you decide you're going to go into medicine at 15 or 16. What, I mean, she stayed her entire career as a teacher?
No, she really didn't. She was only a teacher for a few years. And then after her marriage, she worked very hard on trying to have a successful homestead with her husband. And then, of course, her child Rose came along. She did have another child, a boy, and unfortunately, he did not survive.
Which is
So,
pretty typical. Well, not
yeah,
really, I guess. Yeah, it's pretty typical for the time
yeah, it, it,
that we're
it
talking about.
was, especially again, like we said, with the state of medicine. And as far as the women being doctors, I don't think they necessarily said, well, I'm going to be a doctor. I think how it started was a lot of them were midwives. And of course, they all doctored their children, with home remedies and herbs and things that they would grow. And I think it sort of naturally progressed from there. And that's beginning of the interest of becoming a doctor. And then they were nurses. And then pretty soon they said, well, I can do more. I want to be a doctor too. And that really didn't go over very well when women were starting to enter medical school. Men and women both thought it was a terrible idea, and they had a hard time. They had a hard time getting established, which is why they ended up coming west again out of desperation. And so it that's how their careers began, because they weren't really welcome in the cities in the beginning.
You know about women doctors?
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, where was the Little House on the Prairie set? It was in Minnesota or
The early,
Wisconsin, I believe.
right. The early books were Minnesota and Wisconsin, and then they moved out to Missouri. I think at some point I read in around 1889 that she even briefly lived in Florida.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
That would have
but
been horrible.
I couldn't find a lot. I couldn't really find much information about that, but I was surprised. And considering you and I both lived in Florida, I thought that was kind of
Ooh,
interesting.
phone was ringing.
Oh, is that your phone?
Yep. Yeah, living in Florida in the late 19th century would have been absolutely horrible. I couldn't imagine anything worse. Um,
Well, just the fact that they didn't have air conditioning, that would have been that
yeah,
would have been rough.
the mosquitoes, I mean, everything would have been bad. I'm gonna see if I can look up anything on Florida on this writer. Um, but it's interesting that it's not really what we would consider the West, though, is it? I mean, the prairie, I wouldn't even consider Missouri part of the prairie, I guess. I went to basic training there. I did Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for my basic, and it was hilly. It was really, really hilly.
I
Um,
I think at that point, leaving the cities and going anywhere past the Mississippi was considered west. Going west. Now, further in time, we think of the West as where I am. Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, things like that, and and that was still a huge and major fascination. And in fact, it was one of the reasons why the dime novel became so popular. And they were actually published out of New York. I think Beadle and Adams were the first New York printers to establish the whole idea of the dime novel and have popular characters. And those were just basically outrageously fun. They weren't more of a documentary, or they didn't have a whole lot of truth and basis. They were just super sensational, and people loved them, and because they were so fascinated about this new frontier. So
I
yeah,
got a feeling though
literary.
you can't really count these as dime novels though. I don't
No,
think.
no. And if I led that comparison, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. No, hers are definitely not dime novels.
I mean, I'm
They're in a
looking at the
totally different
sign.
category.
This says home site of Laura Ingalls Wilder. It's in Westville in Holmes County, Florida.
Hmm.
Do you know where that is? I don't either.
I don't
Yeah,
actually.
I've never heard of it. But
I me
at the very bottom of the sign, it says Rose wrote a short story entitled Innocence about their family's time in Florida. It was like 1891. And she won an O. Henry Prize, the second one in 1922, for writing that short story. So, I
Really,
mean,
I never knew that.
this woman is literary pedigree. I mean, she's got chops. She's winning prizes for a short fiction. And this is in 1922, 10 years before Little House on the Prairie comes out. I
Isn't
mean,
that something?
isn't it? I mean, she probably gave her mom credit for writing the books because it was her story anyway. So, Mom, I'm just going to give you your credit. I'm just going to put your name on the cover. Tell me all the stories about you as a kid. I'm going to write them down.
Wow. It for a long time people thought that the whole series, the Little House series, was absolutely, verbatim documentary. These are the things that happened. But, over time, we began to find out that, yes, a lot of it was true, but a lot of the characters were colluged together, or, they were fictional events, maybe some things that happened to other people, but she wove them into the stories. So, yes, they're definitely based on truth, but there are some other things mixed in, again, to make it an interesting story, because it does matter the characters and the perspective, because again, this wasn't necessarily documentary. This was,
Yeah.
we're also trying to sell, a general interest story to people. And yes, I have heard and read that Rose did quite a bit of the work on those.
It's interesting. Um, the idea of it being autobiographical, I am reading right now the memoir of the Navy SEAL who shot bin Laden.
Hmm.
It's obviously a true story, but it's told in a certain way, and he's going back throughout his entire life and telling you stories that has happened to him. In terms of like writing a story down, following the craft of storytelling, he's not really doing much of that. He's not really showing the scene. He's not building it up. He's not using a lot of descriptive words to paint a picture. He's just kind of telling you the story of his life. In terms of these books, though, I've never read them. I am only familiar with it by the television series, which I hated. When that
Oh,
song would play,
really?
oh God, I hated. I was a kid. I was like in the '80s, and it was already syndicated. I think so. But when
Now
it
I'm
came on,
curious, why didn't you like it? What was it
was
about it that turned you off?
I thought it was very slow and methodical. I thought it was very slow. And I mean, I'm really young, 6 or 7, 8 years old when
Sure.
they were in syndication. So as soon as that music would play, I wouldn't want to watch TV anymore. But that's how powerful my dislike of that series was. But it would
Oh,
remain on the TV
no.
because my mom or my father liked it. They liked the idea of the West and living like that. I like the idea of living like that too, except unfortunately, I don't know how real those stories are in terms of the picture they're painting, the historical accuracy.
Well, I would have to admit that there's a mix, but they're all based on, for example, they did live in Walnut Grove, and I believe her parents did try to make some type of a market or a general store or something, and those events failed. So her father went to work in the mill,
Oh
and
wow.
I think she did do some cooking and things in a local restaurant. But the stories are basically based on fact, and I think what made them was there's always a there's always a message or a moral to the story, about perspective or about behavior or about faith. And so yes, I thought they were really nice stories, and I enjoyed them. But I'm sure in the TV series, not everything was drawn from the book. I'm sure that they made up some as they went along.
Are you talking about her mom and dad, as in her dad worked in the mill and her mom obviously was a teacher?
Yes, Laura's mother and father.
Sounds like they lived in town. Sounds like they had a nice little suburban life going on.
Well, they didn't live far from the town. I believe they were only a few miles out, so he could walk, and they could both walk and or take the wagon or a horse or something and quote get to work. So I don't think their commute was that far. And the father did a lot of things to sustain the family and worked lots of different jobs to bring in money because the farming itself didn't didn't do it all, and it was
There's
it
a
was
lot of
very hard
downtime
to.
too, isn't there? I mean, you can only plant so much. You have to wait for stuff to come up. You have like 2 busy times every year, planting and pulling the stuff out of the ground.
Well, the harvest, that's true.
Yeah.
And what happens, of course, when the weather turns bad and your entire harvest and your year's work is ruined?
Having another trade will definitely help a lot during those time periods.
Right.
So
So he was
Mansfield,
often working on and off in different kinds of jobs, just to keep it all going in the right direction and put food on the table.
I wonder if he was a big part of her life growing up, the author herself, not the daughter. Um, because she kind of, I mean, in terms of Michael Landon's character, that's iconic, isn't it?
That
That
relationship, it
Yeah,
is. And I think she alludes to it a lot in the book of her affection and her love for the father, and the way that he used to play his music in the evenings and how much she looked forward to that. They had always wanted, and of course, in a sense, needed a boy to help the father with the work. And since they didn't have one, I think, in my opinion, Laura stepped in to that role and was often helping her father because her sisters were unable to do so. So I think she was a good hard worker and a willing pair
mhm.
of hands.
I don't think you can afford not to be. I'm looking up Mansfield, Missouri, just because I'm curious. It actually it originates in 1882. They moved there probably right when the town started. They probably,
Hmm.
put the post in for the post office, basically. And, to go from that to having a mill to having other things that you can work on and be supportive as a community, I mean, it wouldn't be something that you could sit back and kind of watch happen around you. It would be devastatingly hard work.
Well, I was always under the impression from my readings that the father was very involved every time they moved to a town or at least had to live in a town for a while. He helped govern it. He helped set it up. He helped a lot of the neighbors become more established. Because you got to remember, if you're moving out to the middle of nowhere, you're going to end up having to rely on your neighbors at some point in time.
Yeah.
And so their success is your success. And the town beginning to thrive a little bit is only going to help everybody.
hmm Where's Mansfield in terms of the railroad? 82, you would have had something out there, right?
The railroads were starting to come into some of the towns. And there's actually some really interesting stories about how Pa Ingalls became I guess, a foreman or someone in charge of the railroad crews. And once the trains started coming in, that was an amazing boost because it meant that they could get supplies on a regular basis and travel. Of course, you could go in and out from where you were living. So that was just a lifeline to these smaller towns, and it also helped them grow considerably.
And Mansfield didn't get an actual rail until 1910.
Oh, was it that late?
Yeah, it looks like it. And that ran through Springfield, which I think is the capital of Missouri. I'm not sure. Maybe that's the capital of Illinois. What's the capital of Illinois? Do you know? Or Missouri?
Missouri? I honestly don't know. You've got your internet up. Look it up.
Huh? Oh, it
Boy,
is Jefferson City.
isn't that the school teacher coming out of me? Don't worry, I won't wrap your knuckles.
That's how I live my life on the internet. Anytime I have curiosities, look it up. It's Jefferson City, by the way. So
Okay.
Springfield is probably a pretty small town too, but they didn't get it until 1910. She was already very old by that point, or the city was very old too. 30, 42 years old, something like that.
Well, they certainly lived in a lot of different places, and he was instrumental. The father was instrumental in helping to put together different towns. And then after a while, he would just feel like it was too crowded, or he would get his wanderlust up, or there was just something else that was beyond the bend there, and he would pick up the family and decide to move again, much to the dismay of the mother. I think she really wanted the girls settled, and she wanted them in a town, and she wanted them in school, and she wanted them in church. And Pa was more like, well, let's just see what we can do if we move over here, and we might be able to find better land over here. Or he always had that need to keep moving and to keep going. So it was kind of interesting in the stories to see that dynamic work between the two of them,
Have
the
you
mother and
ever
father.
read like a biography on her, the author herself, Laura Ingall?
I have. I have.
Oh, that's good. So she lived in a lot of different places around Missouri, or did she travel beyond Missouri as well growing up?
No, she did travel beyond Missouri as well. I don't really. I read the biographies some time ago, so I don't have a complete memory of them.
Do you remember
But
how far west she made it?
well, I know that the father really wanted to move up to what they considered to be the Montana Territory, but no, they never made it this far. And let me think, as far as how far they went, I think I think they were in the Dakotas for a while, but that's about it. And you can double check me on that too.
The Dakotas are weird, aren't they? They're like right in the middle. I don't even really consider that the West either. I definitely don't consider Missouri the West, but the Prairie, I don't consider that either. Maybe my
Well,
geography's all messed up.
I think the whole idea, like I said, was leaving the cities. It was a monumental undertaking to do something like that. And I think sometimes people get what they did a little more confused with, they didn't necessarily move west, but they were
Yeah.
pioneers. Does that make sense?
No,
They
totally.
were.
I mean, we are talking about a country that lived on its coasts. I mean, I don't even know about the West Coast at this particular time, but the East Coast was filled with people, very populated. And I mean,
Yeah,
that
we
goes
were.
back. We were talking about the dime store novels and whatnot. I mean, people in the big cities were living vicariously through these novels a little bit, and I guess Little House on the Prairie kind of fed into that a little bit. And the 1930s is kind of late for dime store novels, though, isn't it?
um I believe, yeah, I think so, because they had their heyday, or getting started around 1860 to maybe the 1920s. I think they started to die out, and they were very popular during that time. They weren't books in the sense of we think of books today. They were, maybe 6.5 by 4.5 in size, maybe 100 pages or less. And they were just printed on a thin paper, kind of like a magazine. But they were incredibly popular, and they sold for about 10 to 15 cents a piece. And people began to really follow their favorite types of authors that would write these super sensational, like adventure stories.
Uh-huh.
And I know Ned Buntline was popular. I think Prentice Ingram did the Buffalo Bill series. So, so if you think about it, for example, if we decided to colonize outer space and Mars and the moon and everything, can you imagine we would be sitting here on Earth just really wanting to know all about that, and
Maybe.
looking
We
for
get we
maybe.
get really bored nowadays. We don't care. We have to need constant streams of content. Oh, you're on Mars still? Go to Jupiter and I'll be interested.
Well, I would hope. we would be interested. And so we would want that kind of news. Now, you're right. We have the internet and we have all kinds of ways to get news. But think about it. Back then, they didn't have a lot of ways to get news. So these books and stories, even though they might not have considered them news, they were a huge event to be able to read these books about read these dime novels about what was going on in the West.
Hmm.
And even a newspaper if was exciting to get because it meant you were finding out things outside of your world. Remember, during this time, your world was relatively small.
Yeah, we were just talking about that. It could be a town
Yeah,
that is 10 years old
yeah. Your
with
world,
barely
your
anybody.
world in general is relatively small. You normally didn't travel that far, and you didn't get a whole lot of news. You got some. Now we can get on the internet and be all over the world in a moment, and they couldn't.
It's really interesting too because the same kind of feelings are there too. The sensationalized news that we're getting off the news channels like cable or whatever feels kind of like entertainment. And these dime store novels, back when they were being published, were conflated with news, right? I mean, people would read those stories about Billy the Kid or whatever and take those exploits to heart and think Billy the Kid is this whatever the hell he was, a great gunslinger or whatnot. But in the reality, what was he, a criminal or whatever? Um,
Yeah, and a lot of the characters were just based on somebody, but purely fictional, as
mhm.
far as all their exploits. And but everybody just seemed to like it so much. And the more outrageous and sensational it was, the more they sold. In fact, think of this will make you cry, but an established author at that point in time. Now, this is someone that had a really popular character, okay?
Uh-huh.
They might get $1,000 for their writings, and maybe a really less established one might get, oh, maybe $50 or so for a story.
First,
So
that's $1,000 a story, though. I mean,
for a
I could
story.
write 12 a year. It's $12,000. That's a lot of money back then.
So
Even now, I'd love $12,000.
yeah, so it shows you the value
Yeah.
of how they really valued this kind of work, because for the publishers it was just a moneymaker.
And you talk
And
about the dime store novels being, ramped up a little bit and
mhm,
sensationalized, and the crazier the better. And my mind goes immediately to speculative fiction, how they just continue to ramp it up and add monsters to it and put the action in space or something along those lines. I mean, basically, dime store novels are the predecessor to your comic books and your John Scalzi science fiction or whatever. I mean, they're
exactly.
deeply connected.
Exactly. And of course they kept improving. Um, Let me think. I'm trying to remember because I believe by about 1874, some of them were actually starting to be printed in color. So you can imagine how
How
exciting
exciting
that
it was.
was. Yeah, to be able to get one of these and see some type of color illustrations or color photos or something. And now we kind of have the same idea that when you go with the ebooks and everything, you get these beautiful, photographs, and you can enlarge them and look at them, and so
Huh,
you're right. It's just progressed over
that's
time to
crazy.
a
I mean, there's a picture of Ingalls family, her mom and dad, on her Wikipedia page. And it's probably the one picture they took their entire lives. Maybe they took a dozen, but it's horrible, right? It's blurry. You can barely see. It looks like the guy's dead. His eyes are like wide because he's been told to hold them open and not blink.
That's true.
Um,
That's true. It took so long for the picture to take that they normally didn't smile because their
no,
faces were just
so tired. Don't smile. You'll get exhausted. You'll exhaust yourself. I mean, now I have a phone on my desk and I just take pictures all the time, just over stupid stuff, a menu, I mean, a recipe on the computer screen in front of me. I take a picture of it. I mean, it's just pictures are amazing. They document, right? But we're so used to them. The idea of adding any kind of color to your life is to your entertainment was probably miraculous.
and the dime novels were there was no television,
Yeah.
so you couldn't sit down and watch a show or something, and so these books
And
were
church. That was your entertainment. Once a week you can go to church.
yeah, sing in the choir. Um, well, you did get together with your neighbors and do things, of course, and but you're right. The level of entertainment was not. available like it is now.
Yeah.
So not only was newspapers and magazines and the dime novels so attractive for those reasons, but I think the subject of just a new land, a new adventure, things that they weren't normally going to see or experience, and they could do that through these dime novels.
The people on the East Coast. The people in the middle probably
Absolutely.
weren't doing any reading of anything, nor did they have them stocked in their store. I mean, did she get books like this in the middle of Missouri in 1890, whatever it was? Was she going to the
Yes,
general store and buying dime store novels? I mean, there were no libraries.
no, I rather doubt that at the time.
Yeah,
First of all, that was not a they didn't have the kind of money to be spending it on things like that.
right.
They were a real privilege to have, and she was, her father was scraping around to give her a penny so that she could have a slate and a pencil that she and her sister shared at school.
I mean, what would exactly they be learning in school too? It's not like the school would have a library or a media center. There'd be no books there, no collections that they could read, endless stories or information. They probably had what? A rules of grammar and mathematics, and that's pretty much it.
Right. They had books, of course, that were brought in from the East, but they didn't have books of their own. They normally had them to share and look at. Most of their work was done on a written board, on their slates or something. They didn't really even have paper per se. They just worked on these slates and then would erase it and work on them again. So the schools were relatively poor and they were rural. And most of it was just, like I said, your basics, your basic skills of reading and grammar and mathematics, some poetry, I'm sure some history. I know that they really did study quite a bit of the American history. That was important
Mm-hmm.
to them at that point in time. So all of those academics were looked at, but certainly with a lack of resources that we have now.
Well, exactly, right. I mean,
Yeah.
it does baffle me that this woman comes from this hard scrabble life and was able to write these books. I know we talked about her daughter probably being instrumental in the development the stories and putting them together and sending them to the publishers or whatever, being that she's already
Mhm.
had kind of a history of working in that field. Do we know of anybody else who kind of came from this type of lifestyle who wrote such a successful book? The mom, I mean, Ingalls.
Yeah, I'm trying to not that I can think of off of the top of my head, but I think her stories, that's probably, at least for me, the attraction of the stories and that make them so amazing is that they were just dirt poor. And yet she had an interest. And as she grew older, she found the value of her life and the value of her stories and that she really wanted to pass them on. And that's one of the things I find so inspiring about her.
It's interesting. And where's her place in literary history? Is it cemented, or do you think we'll forget about her eventually?
You know, well, everybody gets forgotten about eventually, but
Not Shakespeare.
yeah, I really feel that
Which is ironic, being that nobody even knows if Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, but he's going to be remembered forever.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Um, I, I don't know that answer, but I can tell you that through the generations, I think that her stories will live for quite a while because I know that I enjoyed them. My girls do. I'm betting that my girls will read them, to their daughters. I know a lot of people who have said, "Oh, I read that to my kids and they loved it." So it's that's what makes it a part of a part of your life and something you want to pass down is that connection. And yeah, I
Curious
think it
though,
will.
you said your daughters and you said you, and I hate this series. I hate it just based on that television show. I mean, I would
I'm
never read it. It was
surprised you're
so
even
boring.
talking. Yeah, I'm surprised you're even talking to me about it today. Oh
But
my
no, I'm
goodness.
curious though, because is this
Yeah.
more gender specific? I mean, is this more of a girl book than a boy book?
I would probably say yes.
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 Why would you say that?
Well, because I
Not just
think
because I hate it, because that's cheating.
I think because it focuses so much on the home life and about the duties of the women and the family, and it is a perspective from a woman. So while they do talk about the really cool and interesting things that Pa Ingalls did, it really does focus more on how we lived every day and how we prepared for every day, how we celebrated, how we managed our hardships, and the whole relationship of the family in general and how they functioned as a unit
Mm.
and had to in order to survive. So yes, I would probably say that girls and women enjoy the books more.
Because it's based in the home.
It,
The women are the strength of the home. They make it happen back then anyway.
yeah, well, I would hope they still do today, but I know what you mean. Things are really changing.
It's a group activity. I think it's men are required to change diapers. Did you know that?
Are they?
Yeah.
Well, my husband did, so he helped me
I
out.
cannot wait for I can't wait for toilet training. I can't wait for it to be over with.
Well, there is a light at the end of that tunnel, so
Hopefully, I would hate to be dropping off diapers for their homeroom in high school.
I would really hate that for you too, Bryan. I would hate that.
And them. I mean, it'd be embarrassing.
Yes, yes.
Here's my son's Huggies. He needs a new one every 5 hours. No, that would be horrible.
Well,
Um,
I have faith in you. I think you'll accomplish your goal and help them out there. So
I
I'm not
think
worried.
I think it's on them. I don't know. Maybe when they start communicating, they're pretty good actually. Their diapers are usually dry. Why are we talking about my children's potty training?
I don't know. It must have
you know,
triggered a memory for you somewhere because you brought it up.
do you know what's really interesting to me is that when she died, she left the rights to the novels to a library, right? She gave permission to a library to own the copyright to her all her work. But somehow when she died, the copyright got passed on to her daughter, and her daughter held on to it until she died. And at one point, after one of these generations, the rights of these books were supposed to go to the library in Mansfield, and they have never done that. They've been to court over it back and forth, trying to figure it
Huh.
out.
Really? So you're saying that right now the rights are still with the deceased daughter?
No, the rights are with the family, who's ever alive now,
Oh,
and the
oh,
library
okay.
actually took them to court, and there was some kind of arbitration and settlement, but the family still owns the rights. And the goal of the mom was for the rights to go to the library.
Huh. Isn't that interesting? Well, that's going to be that'll be interesting to see how that turns out. It sounds
What's
like
yeah,
they're still pursuing it.
still pursuing it. In 1992, I think was when the Mansfield Public Library sued the family. And I mean, that even goes back to Ingalls not being the author of the work, but more like the narrator to the daughter writing it down. And she tried to take the book's rights away from her own flesh and blood at the end of out of her life. Like she did the work at 65 years old to make those things classics.
Huh.
It's
Yeah.
kind of sad in a way too. I mean, that would make a great movie. This person looking for an angle to get herself published and kind of, I mean, a famous literary mind, and she writes it under her mom's name, and then they blow up. I mean, it's got to be kind of a nightmare if you think about it. The egotist of the ego of a writer losing credit for the work they did.
Yeah, for the work that they accomplished. Well, I know that they were basically a team for years. I don't
But
know
that
anything
daughter's name
about.
isn't on those books, though.
I know, and I don't know anything about their relationship as when the daughter was an adult and they were working on these things as partners, and I don't know enough about that to comment on the relationship or how well that worked out or how well it didn't.
Wouldn't that be a nice
Um,
bit of information? Did they have a good relationship? Did they appreciate each other's company, or was the mom kind of an authoritative figure that squatted over the daughter and made her do things she didn't want to do? But we don't know that stuff. We don't know anything about their education, do we?
we really don't. We don't have a lot of information, other than the fact that they worked on the books together. In fact, there really, as far as I can tell, not a lot of information about their relationship. Um,
They
And
died
they,
almost right on top of each other.
yeah, you
They
can
both
assume
died in the
that it was
60s.
good or assume that it was bad or something in between. I really don't know.
Well, if you had to assume, if you had to speculate on the relationship based on the books, and we don't have anything else, they both died in the 60s before anybody cared, and all we
Hmm.
have left is this, and then there's that rights, the copyright thing that just kind of, it's still kind of working its way through the court system in a way. What
Hmm.
would you say, good or bad, the relationship with each other?
My guess, my guess would be that it was mostly good, but any type of relationship when you're professionally working with somebody, there's going to be some kind of friction there. So you have to wonder how they would get along in trying to craft, these stories. But but there had to be a basis of love and respect and caring. Otherwise, they wouldn't have decided to work together. And I don't think the mother would have wanted to help her at all.
Well, but
So
she helped the mother though, didn't she? The
yeah.
mother didn't do anything for her.
Um, well, I think the mother did a lot for her, but maybe not later in her professional realm, as far as helping her with her career or something. You're probably
Mm.
right. I think the daughter forged all that on her own.
What
But
did the daughter write? Did she end up writing novels of her own later on, or was it always short fiction?
I think it was just short fiction, and I think it was often again about the stories of that pioneer kind of lifestyle. And I think she submitted a lot of the short stories, which is how her career in her literary career in publishing began. And then I think, as far as I know, she devoted herself exclusively to working with her mom on all of these books, about her mother's pioneer life.
Yeah, I was gonna say she died right after, but no, it was 11 years. So that's a pretty decent amount of time to actually do some stuff in. It's an interesting story. It really is. I'm did not know it going into it, and now that I do, it's fun to play with in your mind. That these people came from something they created on their own, basically, and
Hmm.
not only that, but were able to write stories about it that fed the imaginations of generations of people, including Michael Landon, who made a great television show about it.
He did. He did. And did you know that he was so concerned about making it look authentic that the clothing that they wore, he actually had people hand weave the cloth and make the clothes in the style of the period.
It's interesting.
So that's how devoted he was to the idea of accurately showing, what it was like at that point in time. And that the TV series was based on the era of that Walnut Grove time period where they lived there. And we never really saw a whole lot of shows or anything about, for example, the time in Minnesota or when Laura was much younger and getting started. So that I always thought that would have been interesting too, because the first book about them living out, in the big woods, which was different from later when they got into the towns. Yeah.
Is there anything that we missed out on saying about Laura Ingalls Wilder that you think is pertinent to the conversation that needs to be mentioned?
I can only think thing that I was going to mention that I thought was nice to close with, and that's the fact that she had a nice quote that I read about, and it said, "Home is the nicest word there is."
Oh, I read that. Yeah, that is nice, isn't it?
Yeah, and I just thought that was kind of a lovely thing for her to say, and that's a good thing to be remembered by, and because I sort of feel the same way. So that's probably about the only really other relevant thing I was going to mention.
Well, I really enjoyed talking to you about this author. I didn't know about her prior to talking with you. The only thing I was familiar with was Little House on the Prairie, which, again, we've talked about it. My opinion's not of the highest regard with it.
Well, I
Um,
wished I knew more about her. I'm not, like I said, I'm not really studied or schooled. It's just kind of my opinions and what I've read here and there. So thank goodness for your internet searches while we were talking.
Hey, it's all about speculation. You don't know anything until you speculate about it. And nobody's going to tell you you're wrong if the person that you're talking to doesn't know what they're talking about either. And this was a lot of fun. I look forward to future conversations with you about Western work and whatever you want to talk about for that matter. Because as I've noticed with this podcast, you can pretty much go wherever you want the
You
authors.
can.
It's
You
interesting.
can. And that's what makes it so much fun. So I'm glad. I'm glad you suggested it, and thank you very much.